Quick heads up, no script came through with this message either, just the topic. Since this matches the pattern from your last few requests, I'll go ahead and build this one entirely from deep research, using the same narrative style, pacing, and hook structure as the scripts I've already written for you in this conversation. Let me dig into the Spain DNA research now. Somewhere in central Spain, at a Bronze Age burial site called Castillejo de Bonete, archaeologists uncovered a man and woman buried side by side, seemingly a couple, seemingly connected. But when scientists finally sequenced their DNA, they found something the archaeologists never expected. These two people, buried together in what looked like an intimate final resting place, had almost entirely different genetic ancestries, as if two completely separate populations had collided, mixed, and then been laid to rest together without anyone alive today ever knowing the full story of how they ended up side by side. And that single grave turned out to be a perfect symbol for something much bigger, something ancient DNA has only recently exposed about the entire population of Spain. Because the story we thought we knew, of a single, proud, unbroken Iberian people descending in a straight line from ancient times to today, is not what the genetics actually shows. The real story involves a population almost completely erased and replaced not once, but multiple times. An entire generation of men who mysteriously vanished from the gene pool almost overnight, and genetic fingerprints from North Africa, the Russian steppe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Northern Europe, all buried inside the DNA of modern Spaniards. So if you think you know where the people of Spain actually came from, stay with me, because what their ancient DNA reveals is stranger, messier, and far more shocking than any textbook version of Spanish history ever told. Let's start with why Spain, of all places, turned out to be such an extraordinary genetic time capsule in the first place. The Iberian Peninsula, home to modern Spain and Portugal, sits in an unusually significant geographic position, wedged between North Africa, continental Europe, and the Mediterranean Sea, making it one of the most important genetic crossroads on the entire continent. And there is a climate-related reason this region became so genetically important, going back tens of thousands of years. During the depths of the last ice age, roughly 18,000 to 24,000 years ago, while much of Europe was buried under brutal glacial conditions, Iberia remained relatively warm, offering a refuge where humans and animals fleeing the freezing north could survive. Researchers studying Iberian hunter-gatherer DNA discovered that different hunter-gatherer populations converged and mixed on this warm peninsula as early as 19,000 years ago, meaning Spain was acting as a genetic melting pot long before agriculture, long before writing, long before anything we would recognize as civilization existed anywhere in Europe. Then, around 8,000 years ago, farmers began arriving in Iberia, part of the same broader Neolithic wave that transformed the rest of Europe, bringing agriculture and permanent settlements. But even this transition held a surprise, because researchers uncovered evidence of a previously unknown Stone Age migration route running through northern Spain roughly 8,000 years ago, a movement of people nobody had detected before ancient DNA analysis revealed it. Layer by layer, every time scientists sequence a new batch of ancient Iberian skeletons, they find evidence of yet another wave of people nobody had previously accounted for, each one leaving genetic fingerprints buried inside the bones of the people who came after them. But the single most dramatic discovery in the entire genetic history of Spain, the one that genuinely stunned the research team who found it, happened during the Bronze Age, and it centers on what happened to Iberian men specifically. In 2019, a massive international study led by geneticist Inigo Olalde at Harvard Medical School, working alongside the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, analyzed the genomes of 271 ancient individuals spanning 8,000 years of Iberian history, comparing them against more than 1,100 previously studied ancient genomes and nearly 3,000 modern ones. And when the team reached the Bronze Age layer of their data, starting around 2500 BC and continuing for roughly 500 years, they found something so unexpected that Olalde himself described it as one of the strongest pieces of evidence for sex-biased population change ever found in ancient DNA research anywhere in the world. Here is what happened. Beginning around 4,500 years ago, a new population arrived in Iberia, descended from shepherds and herders who had migrated from the steppes of Eastern Europe, carrying genetic ancestry connected to the same Russian steppe populations, responsible for reshaping so much of the rest of the continent during this same era. Over the following centuries, these newcomers and the existing Iberian population interbred, and when researchers examined the genetic makeup of the resulting population, they found the incoming steppe ancestry accounted for roughly 40% of the overall Bronze Age Iberian gene pool. That number alone would already be a significant finding. But then researchers looked specifically at the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed exclusively from father to son, and what they found bordered on unbelievable. The local Iberian male lineages had been almost completely wiped out. Nearly 100% of the Y chromosomes present in the population after this transition traced back to the newcomers, while the mitochondrial DNA, passed only through mothers, showed far more continuity from the earlier population. In practical terms, this means that while 40% of the total ancestry shifted, the paternal lines, the actual fathers passing their Y chromosome forward generation after generation, were almost entirely replaced, virtually erased from the historical record in the span of a few centuries, while women from the earlier population continued having children who carried their maternal lineage forward. Researchers still do not fully agree on what actually happened to cause this. Some have proposed dramatic scenarios involving violent conflict, warfare, or one population systematically eliminating the reproductive success of the other, and initial media coverage certainly leaned into the darker interpretation. But researchers who worked directly on the study urged caution against assuming the worst, noting that the underlying social mechanism, whether it involved violence, a status-based mating system where incoming men gained disproportionate access to reproduction, disease, or some entirely different social upheaval nobody has thought to model yet, remains genuinely unknown. What is not in question is the result itself, clearly written into the DNA. Something happened in Bronze Age Iberia, dramatic enough to almost completely erase one population's paternal lineage in a few hundred years, and to this day, nobody knows exactly why. And Iberia's genetic transformation did not stop there. As the same massive study traced the population forward through history, it uncovered wave after wave of newcomers, layering themselves into the Iberian gene pool, each one leaving a permanent trace still detectable today. Around 4,000 years ago, researchers found direct evidence of North African ancestry appearing in the Iberian interior, including one individual buried in the middle of the peninsula whose DNA showed such a clear North African signature that lead researcher Inigo Alalda initially assumed his own team had made an analysis mistake, before confirming it was real. Centuries later, during the era of Greek, Phoenician, and Roman expansion across the Mediterranean, researchers analyzing burials from the ancient Greek colony of Empúries in northeastern Spain, founded somewhere around 600 BC and inhabited into the late Roman period, found something that beautifully illustrates how mixed ancient Iberian society had already become. Among 24 individuals studied at the site, researchers identified two genetically distinct groups buried within the same community, one carrying typical Greek ancestry, and another that was genetically indistinguishable from the Iberian population living in a nearby village, showing Greek settlers and local Iberians living, and quite likely intermarrying, within the same colonial community. By the early Middle Ages, the research found that roughly a quarter of Iberian ancestry had already been reshaped by new population flows arriving from the eastern Mediterranean, carried in by Romans, Greeks, and Phoenicians over the preceding centuries. Then came the Visigoths, a Germanic people who swept into Iberia as the Roman Empire crumbled, establishing a kingdom that ruled much of the peninsula for nearly 3 centuries. Researchers studying burials linked to this period found two individuals at a site in Girona carrying clear Eastern European ancestry, and strikingly, mitochondrial DNA typical of populations from Asia, a genetic echo of the extraordinarily long and complicated migration history behind the Visigothic kingdoms, whose origins traced back through Central and Eastern Europe, and further still, connected to nomadic steppe populations whose ancestral roots extended toward Asia. It is a genetic reminder that the Visigoths were not a purely Germanic population sweeping in from next door, but rather the product of centuries of their own mixing and migration across a huge stretch of the ancient world before they ever set foot in Iberia. And then came the transformation that arguably shaped Spain's identity more than any other single event in its history, the Islamic conquest that began in 711 AD, bringing nearly 800 years of Muslim rule to large portions of the Iberian Peninsula. Researchers analyzing burials from this Islamic period, recovered from sites in Granada, Valencia, Castellón, and Vinaros, found something genuinely striking. These individuals carried a North African genetic component making up close to 50% of their total ancestry, an extraordinarily high proportion, reflecting just how deeply North African populations settled into and mixed with existing Iberian communities during centuries of Muslim rule. But here is the part of this discovery that genuinely surprises people once they hear it. When researchers compared that medieval Islamic period North African ancestry to the North African genetic component found in the Spanish and Portuguese population today, they found it had dropped dramatically, down to a residual signal of only around 5% in the modern population. That is an enormous decline, and it reflects the aftermath of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to retake the peninsula that culminated in 1492, followed by mass expulsions and forced conversions targeting Muslim and Jewish populations across Spain. The The genetic record itself preserves the demographic consequences of that historical rupture, a population whose ancestry was nearly halved in terms of North African heritage within a relatively short historical window, a quiet, permanent genetic scar left behind by one of the most consequential religious and political upheavals in European history. Now here is one final twist buried inside this research that connects directly to a genuinely fascinating mystery that has puzzled linguists and geneticists for generations: the Basque people of northern Spain and southwestern France. The Basque language, Euskara, is famously considered a linguistic isolate, meaning it is not related to any other known language family on Earth, an astonishing anomaly in a continent almost entirely dominated by Indo-European languages descended from those same steppe migrations that transformed the rest of Iberia and Europe thousands of years ago. For decades, this linguistic mystery fueled speculation that the Basques might represent some kind of untouched ancient population, a genetically pure relic surviving in isolation since prehistoric times. When researchers finally examined Basque DNA within this massive Iberian genome study, they found something more nuanced than the old myth, but genuinely fascinating in its own right. The modern Basque population's genetic makeup closely matches that of typical Iron Age Iberians, essentially preserving the genetic profile of the population that existed in the region before the later waves of Roman, Visigothic, and Islamic influence significantly reshaped the rest of the peninsula's ancestry. In other words, the Basques were not some separate alien population untouched by any outside influence throughout all of history. They absorbed the same deep ancestral layers as everyone else in Iberia, including the steppe ancestry and the near-total Bronze Age replacement of local male lineages. But unlike the rest of Spain, their region was comparatively less affected by the later historical waves of migration and admixture that swept through the rest of the peninsula, essentially freezing their genetic profile closer to an earlier snapshot of Iberian ancestry, while the language and culture around them continued to evolve in isolation. So when you put the entire timeline together, the true genetic story of Spain looks almost nothing like the simplified narrative most people grow up believing. It begins with Ice Age hunter-gatherers converging on a uniquely warm refuge, while the rest of Europe froze, mixing together into a genetically diverse founding population 19,000 years ago. Then, Neolithic farmers arrive from the eastern Mediterranean, reshaping the population again. Then, in one of the most dramatic and least understood events in all of European prehistory, steppe descended. Newcomers arrive during the Bronze Age, and something happens. We still do not know exactly what, that virtually erases the paternal lineage of the existing male population within a few centuries, while contributing to roughly 40% of the overall ancestry shift. Then, North African populations, Phoenician and Greek and Roman settlers, Visigothic rulers with genetic roots stretching back toward Asia, and finally, centuries of Islamic rule bringing North African ancestry to nearly half the population in some regions, all layer themselves into the Iberian gene pool, one wave after another, each one leaving a permanent, readable trace inside the DNA of the people living there. And even the Basques, long mythologized as an untouched genetic island, turned out to be not some separate ancient race, but rather a population that absorbed the same deep prehistoric layers as their neighbors, simply less reshaped by everything that came afterward. What all of this really reveals is something bigger than just the history of one country. It reveals just how thoroughly human history is a story of collision, replacement, migration, and mixing, repeated over and over again, in nearly every corner of the globe, no matter how proud or unified any particular national identity feels today. The idea of a pure, unbroken Spanish bloodline stretching back into the ancient past simply does not survive contact with the actual DNA. What survives instead is something far more interesting. A genetic record showing that the people of Spain today carry inside them fragments of Ice Age hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, steppe herders, whose arrival triggered one of the most dramatic demographic upheavals ever detected in ancient DNA, North African settlers, Phoenician and Greek and Roman colonists, Visigothic rulers with ancestry stretching toward Asia, and centuries of Islamic civilization whose genetic legacy, though diminished by later historical events, still lingers quietly within the modern population. Every single person walking through the streets of Madrid or Barcelona or Seville today is, whether they realize it or not, a living genetic archive of nearly every major migration and civilization that has ever touched the Mediterranean world. And ancient DNA, patiently extracted from bones buried for thousands of years, is the only reason we now have the tools to actually read that archive and finally understand the truth it has been holding on to in silence the entire time.